My name is Arthur Wilson, and I'm 32 years old. My father was my hero, my mentor, and my best friend until cancer stole him from me last month. What hurts more than losing him is how my stepmom Jessica robbed me of saying goodbye. She thought shutting me out of the will reading was her final victory. Little did she know I had the real will my father secretly left me. When I handed that file to her lawyer, her face drained of all color. Sometimes justice comes when you least expect it, but exactly when you need it most. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The look on my stepmom's face when her plans fell apart was priceless, and you won't want to miss what happened next. My childhood was pretty normal until I turned 12. That was when my mom lost her battle with breast cancer. The memory of her funeral still haunts me sometimes. My dad standing beside me, his hand gripping mine so tight it almost hurt. He was trying to be strong for me, but I could feel him trembling. We were both lost without her. For the next 4 years, it was just Dad and me against the world. We stumbled through it together, learning to cook, do laundry, and navigate life without Mom. Dad was the CEO of a successful construction company, and despite his busy schedule, he always made time for me. He'd come to every baseball game, every parent-teacher conference, and we had pizza and movie nights every Friday without fail. Those years were tough, but they cemented our bond in ways I couldn't appreciate until much later. Then Jessica entered our lives. Dad met her at a charity gala when I was 16. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in me at first. I was wary, naturally protective of the relationship I had with my dad, but I tried to accept her for his sake. He seemed happier than he had been in years, and I couldn't begrudge him that. 3 months after they started dating, Jessica moved into our house with her 2 children, Trevor and Cassandra. Trevor was 15, just a year younger than me, while Cassandra was 12. I tried to welcome them, offering to show Trevor around my school since he would be transferring there, but he made it clear he wasn't interested in being friends. Cassandra was quieter, mostly keeping to herself, but followed her brother's lead in keeping me at arm's length. The real issues began subtly. Jessica would make comments that seemed innocent on the surface, but were designed to create distance between Dad and me. "Arthur is so independent, Richard. You don't need to check in with him so often," she would say. Or, "Don't you think Arthur is a bit old for your movie nights? He probably wants to hang out with his friends instead." Dad didn't see it at first, but our time together gradually diminished. Our Friday movie nights became monthly, then occasional. Jessica always had a reason. A work event for Dad, plans with her children that somehow couldn't include me, or some other obligation she'd created. When I tried to talk to Dad about it, she'd already planted seeds of doubt, suggesting I was jealous or unwilling to accept our new family dynamic. By the time I left for college at Northwestern, 2 hours away from our Chicago home, there was a noticeable gap between my father and me. I still called him weekly, but Jessica often answered the phone, telling me he was busy or promising he would call back later. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. I tried not to take it personally, but it hurt. Despite the growing distance, I worked hard to maintain our relationship. During breaks, I would come home and try to spend time with Dad, though Jessica always seemed to have him scheduled for something. I'd catch moments with him alone in his home office or the garage where he liked to restore classic cars, his lifelong passion. After graduating with a degree in business, I took a job with a consulting firm in Indianapolis. Close enough to visit, but far enough to have my own life. I would drive up to Chicago at least once a month to see Dad, and we would grab lunch or spend a few hours in the garage working on whatever car he was restoring at the time. Those moments, rare as they became, were precious to me. Dad's construction company continued to thrive under his leadership. Wilson Construction had grown from a small local business. My grandfather started into one of Chicago's premier commercial builders. Dad had expanded into residential developments too, building luxury homes in the suburbs. By his early 60s, he had built substantial wealth and was well respected in the business community. Then came the diagnosis. 3 years ago, Dad called me himself, something that had become increasingly rare. "Arthur, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. The doctors found something. That something was stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis wasn't good, but Dad was determined to fight it with everything he had. I'll never forget that day. It was the first time since Mom died that I saw real fear in my father's eyes. When Dad started treatment, I immediately requested a leave of absence from my job. My boss was understanding, and my colleagues stepped up to cover my projects. Nothing was more important than being there for Dad during this battle. I rented a small apartment near my father's house so I could be close without having to live under the same roof as Jessica, which would have created unnecessary tension. The first few months of treatment were brutal. Chemotherapy ravaged Dad's once strong body, and radiation left him exhausted. I drove him to appointments, researched treatment options, and spent hours sitting by his hospital bed when he needed to stay overnight for procedures, or when the side effects became too severe to manage at home. Jessica played the role of devoted wife beautifully when others were watching. Hospital staff praised her dedication, and family friends commented on how lucky Dad was to have her. But I saw a different side when no one else was around. She would check her watch impatiently during hospital visits, step outside to make calls that she insisted couldn't wait, and sometimes wouldn't show up at all, citing commitments with Trevor and Cassandra. One afternoon, I arrived at the hospital earlier than expected and found Jessica going through Dad's briefcase. When she saw me, she quickly closed it, claiming she was looking for insurance information. But there was something about her hurried movements and the flash of guilt in her eyes that set off alarm bells. I started paying closer attention. A few days later, while Dad was sleeping after a particularly difficult treatment session, I noticed Jessica slipping some papers into her purse. When I asked about them, she became defensive, saying they were just some household bills she needed to take care of. Dad woke up during our tense exchange and changed the subject, but the incident stuck with me. As the months passed and the treatments continued, there were good days and bad. On one of the better days, Dad asked me to drive him to his bank downtown. Jessica was at a spa day with Cassandra, so we had a rare opportunity to be alone together. At the bank, Dad accessed his safe deposit box and removed a small key. "Arthur," he said, his voice weak but determined, "I want you to have this. It's to another box, one Jessica doesn't know about." He pressed the key into my palm. "When the time comes, you'll know what to do." I tried to ask him what he meant, but he shook his head. "Not here. Not now. Just keep the key safe." That was all he would say about it. On the drive home, we talked about the old days, about Mom, about the classic Mustang we had restored together when I was in high school. It felt like the Dad I knew was back, if only for a brief time. As Dad's condition worsened, Jessica became increasingly controlling about who could visit him and when. She implemented a schedule, supposedly to ensure he got enough rest, but somehow my allotted times were frequently canceled or shortened. Meanwhile, her children, who had rarely visited during the early months of Dad's illness, suddenly became regular fixtures at the house. Trevor, now in his late 20s and working for a financial firm, started having frequent closed-door meetings with Dad that Jessica insisted not be disturbed. Cassandra, who had just finished college, began spending more time at the house too, often sitting with Jessica when they spoke with Dad's doctors or financial advisors. I voiced my concerns to Dad's oncologist, Dr. Mitchell, who had become something of an ally. He shared my frustrations but was limited in what he could do. "Your father is still legally competent to make his own decisions," he explained gently, "and as his wife, Jessica has certain rights regarding his care. I can make sure you're informed about his medical condition, but I can't override her control of visitor access at home." My suspicions about Jessica's intentions continued to grow. Once, I overheard her on the phone with someone, discussing what sounded like property valuations for Dad's business assets. Another time, I found brochures for retirement communities in Florida in her car when I was helping bring in groceries, even though Dad had always been adamant about staying in Chicago, where he had built his life and business. The night before Dad died was the final betrayal. His condition had deteriorated rapidly, and Dr. Mitchell called to suggest I come to the hospital immediately. When I arrived, Jessica was outside his room with a security guard. She claimed Dad was too weak for visitors and had specifically requested family only. "I am family," I insisted, my voice breaking. The security guard looked uncomfortable but stood firm. "His real family," Jessica said coldly. "He needs peace now, not stress." I spent the night in the hospital waiting room, hoping for a chance to see him. Around 4 in the morning, Dr. Mitchell found me there and sat down heavily beside me. I knew from his expression what he was going to say. Dad had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Jessica had been with him. I never got to say goodbye. The morning of Dad's funeral arrived with a grim, overcast sky that matched my mood perfectly. I had barely slept the night before, tormented by the thought that Dad had died without me having the chance to say goodbye properly. But I was determined to honor him one last time and say the words I never got to say at his service. I arrived at the funeral home an hour early, dressed in the dark blue suit Dad had helped me pick out for my first job interview. I wanted some quiet time with him before others arrived, a private moment to say my piece. But when I walked in, I found the funeral director in a state of confusion. "Mr. Wilson, we weren't expecting you for another hour," he said, checking his clipboard. "The family viewing isn't scheduled to begin until 10. "That's impossible," I replied. "The service was set for 9. I have the email confirmation." I showed him the message on my phone. The director frowned. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Wilson changed all the arrangements yesterday. She said she had informed everyone. The public visitation starts at 10, and the service is at 11 now." My stomach dropped. I had been deliberately given the wrong information. By the time I returned at 10, the funeral home was already filling with people. Jessica stood by the closed casket, dressed immaculately in black, receiving condolences with Trevor and Cassandra flanking her like guards. When she saw me, her expression flickered briefly with annoyance before settling back into practiced grief. I approached the casket, intending to have at least a moment with Dad. But as I got closer, Jessica smoothly intercepted me, taking my arm and steering me towards some distant relatives. "The minister is about to begin," she whispered. "We need to take our seats. You can pay your respects after the service." But after the service, she made sure I was pulled into conversations with attendees, and by the time I broke free, the funeral director was already closing the casket for transportation to the cemetery. My chance was gone. During the service, I had been scheduled to speak about Dad, to share memories and say goodbye. It was the one thing I had asked for and had been assured I would have. But when the time came for family tributes, Jessica approached the podium with a sorrowful expression. Arthur was supposed to speak about his father today, she announced to the gathering, but he appears to have arrived late. Rather than disrupt the service, I'll share some words instead. I sat there, stunned and humiliated, as she spoke about their life together. About how Dad had been like a father to Trevor and Cassandra, barely mentioning my existence, or the 32 years Dad and I had shared before she entered the picture. The cemetery service was no better. Jessica positioned herself, Trevor, and Cassandra directly beside the grave, physically blocking me from standing with them. I was forced to stand in the second row, behind Dad's business associates, as if I were just another acquaintance rather than his son. As people began to leave the cemetery, I made one last attempt to have a private moment at Dad's casket before it was lowered. But Jessica intercepted me again. "I think you've caused enough of a scene today," she said quietly, her voice laced with venom, despite her public face of grief. Richard wouldn't have wanted a spectacle. "I just want to say goodbye," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "You had years to say whatever you needed to say to him," she replied coldly. "Now it's time to respect the family's grief." As if I wasn't family, as if my grief didn't count. As I turned away, devastated, I overheard Jessica speaking to a man in an expensive suit whom I didn't recognize from Dad's business or social circles. "We need to move quickly," she was saying. "I want everything transferred before there can be any complications. Meet me at your office tomorrow with the paperwork." The man, who I would later learn was attorney Maxwell Shepard, nodded discreetly. "Everything is prepared for the reading. 10 o'clock tomorrow." A will reading scheduled for the very next day? It seemed indecently rushed, even by Jessica's standards. As I was leaving, trying to process everything that had happened, I was approached by Robert Hayes, Dad's oldest friend and business partner. "Arthur," he said, clasping my shoulder, "I'm so sorry about today. This isn't what Richard would have wanted." He glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot. "Your father was concerned in his final months. He asked me to tell you to trust your instincts." I'm not sure what he meant, but he was quite insistent. As Robert walked away, I felt the weight of the small key in my pocket, the one Dad had given me at the bank. "When the time comes, you'll know what to do," he had said. Standing in the cemetery, watching the people who had come to honor my father dispersing, I realized the time had come. The morning after the funeral, I woke up early and drove to Chicago Trust Bank downtown. Dad had banked there for decades, but this wasn't his usual branch. This was the location where he had given me the mysterious key. My hands trembled slightly as I presented my ID and the key to the bank manager. "I'd like to access this safe deposit box, please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The manager checked the records. "Box 477. You're listed as the authorized accessor, Mr. Wilson. Please follow me." He led me to a private room after retrieving the box, then left me alone with it. For a moment, I just stared at the rectangular metal container, almost afraid to open it. Whatever Dad had deemed important enough to hide from Jessica was inside, and once I knew its contents, there would be no going back. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the box and raised the lid. Inside was a large manila envelope with "For Arthur" written in Dad's distinctive handwriting, along with several folders and what looked like a thumb drive. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a letter, dated just 3 months ago, when Dad's health had begun its final decline. "Arthur," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And things have probably played out as I feared they might. I owe you an explanation and an apology." The letter continued for several pages. Dad explained that about a year ago, he had begun to suspect Jessica's motives had never been pure. He had accidentally discovered emails between her and Trevor, discussing how to maximize their inheritance once Dad was gone. Disturbed but not yet convinced of full betrayal, Dad had started paying closer attention. He detailed how he'd noticed financial documents going missing from his home office, how Jessica had begun pressing him to make changes to his will and business succession plans. He described finding her secretly photographing his financial statements and private business contracts. "I should have listened to your concerns years ago," he wrote. "But I was lonely after your mother died, and Jessica filled that void. By the time I realized my mistake, she had already isolated me from you in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. I'm sorry, son. I failed you." The letter went on to explain that Dad had created a new will just 2 months before his death, when he still had periods of clarity and legal competence. He had gone to a different attorney than the family lawyer Jessica knew about, and he had asked Robert Hayes to witness the signing. "Jessica believes the will names her as the primary beneficiary of my estate," Dad wrote. "She's been pressuring me to sign papers, and sometimes I've pretended to comply just to buy time. But the real will is in this box, and it tells a very different story." I set aside the letter with shaking hands and opened the first folder. There it was. Last Will and Testament of Richard James Wilson, dated just 8 weeks before his death, properly signed and notarized. I scanned the contents quickly, my heart racing. Dad had left me majority ownership of Wilson Construction, along with the family home and most of his personal assets. Jessica received a reasonable settlement that would allow her to live comfortably, but nowhere near the windfall she clearly expected. Trevor and Cassandra received modest trust funds for education or business ventures, but again, nothing like what Jessica had likely promised them. The second folder contained what appeared to be evidence Dad had gathered about Jessica's past. There were background check results showing she had been involved in 2 previous lawsuits with former partners, both wealthy older men who had claimed financial manipulation. Both cases had been settled out of court. There were also printouts of emails between Jessica and Trevor discussing their plans for Dad's business once it was theirs, with Trevor commenting that they could sell off the assets for a substantial profit and move to Florida. The thumb drive contained recordings Dad had made of conversations with Jessica in his final months, where she had pressured him about changing his will and business arrangements. In one particularly disturbing recording, she could be heard telling Dad that seeing me upset him too much and was bad for his health, which was why she needed to manage my visits. The final folder contained a letter from Dad's private investigator, detailing how Jessica had been in contact with several real estate developers about potentially selling Dad's business properties after his death, even getting preliminary valuations, all while Dad was still fighting for his life. I sat in that small bank room for over an hour, absorbing everything. The betrayal was even deeper than I had suspected, but Dad had known, and he had protected both me and his legacy. The question now was how to proceed. Before leaving the bank, I called Robert Hayes and asked to meet him immediately. Over coffee at a nearby diner, I showed him the will and explained what I had found. "I'm not surprised," Robert said grimly. "Richard confided some of his suspicions to me, but he wanted to handle it his way. He was always protecting you, right to the end." He paused, studying me. "What are you going to do now?" "Jessica's having the will reading today at 10, I said, checking my watch. "It's 9:15 now." Robert's eyes lit up with understanding. Perfect timing. "Do you know who her lawyer is?" I asked. "Maxwell Shepherd," Robert replied. "Ambitious young attorney from Bennett and Crane. Not particularly ethical from what I've heard." He gave me a shrewd look. "You're going to crash the reading, aren't you?" I nodded, gathering the documents and placing them carefully in my briefcase. Dad said I'd know what to do when the time came. This is it. Robert smiled for the first time since before the funeral. Richard would be proud. Do you want me to come with you? I considered it but shook my head. No. This is something I need to do alone. But thank you, Robert, for everything. As I stood to leave, Robert caught my arm. Arthur, be prepared. Jessica won't go down without a fight. This could get ugly. I nodded, feeling a steely resolve settling over me. I'm counting on it. At precisely 9:55, I walked into the lobby of Bennett and Crane Law offices, located in one of Chicago's sleek downtown skyscrapers. My heart was pounding, but my steps were steady as I approached the receptionist. I'm here for the Wilson will reading, I said confidently. She checked her computer. Of course, Mr. Wilson. Conference room C. Down the hall to your right. I walked down the corridor, my father's real will and evidence secure in my briefcase. As I approached the conference room, I could see through the glass door that Jessica, Trevor, and Cassandra were already seated around a large table with Maxwell Shepherd and another attorney I didn't recognize. The moment I pushed open the door, the conversation inside abruptly halted. Jessica's head snapped up, her expression morphing from surprise to cold anger in an instant. Arthur, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. There must be a misunderstanding. We didn't expect you today. Clearly, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Trevor stood up, his 6'2" frame blocking my path to the table. This is a private meeting, he said firmly. Cassandra remained seated but shifted uncomfortably, not meeting my eyes. I stood my ground. I believe I have a right to be here. This is my father's will reading. Jessica gave a small, practiced laugh. Arthur, I understand this is a difficult time for you, but this meeting is only for heirs named in the will. She exchanged a look with Maxwell Shepherd, who cleared his throat. Mrs. Wilson is correct, Shepherd said, though he looked slightly uncomfortable. According to the document we're reviewing today, the meeting should include only Mrs. Wilson and her children. I noticed he carefully avoided saying I wasn't an heir, just that I wasn't included in today's document. A careful legal distinction. He knew something wasn't right here. I see, I said calmly, making no move to leave. And which will would that be, Mr. Shepherd? The one my father supposedly signed 3 weeks before his death, when he was heavily medicated and barely conscious. Jessica's smug smile faltered slightly. Arthur, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Your father made his wishes clear. Did he? I asked, taking a step forward. Trevor didn't budge, continuing to block my path. I looked directly at Maxwell Shepherd. Mr. Shepherd, as an officer of the court, I believe you would want to ensure that my father's true last wishes are honored. Am I correct? Shepherd hesitated, glancing between me and Jessica. Of course, but we have a legally signed and witnessed document. So do I replied, finally moving around Trevor to approach the table. I set my briefcase down and removed the file containing Dad's real will, along with copies of the evidence he had collected. Without another word, I handed the file directly to Shepherd, not to Jessica. I believe you'll find this will is more recent, properly executed, and reflects my father's actual wishes when he was of sound mind. Shepherd opened the file, his professional composure cracking as he reviewed the documents inside. His eyes widened, and he quickly flipped through the pages, comparing dates and signatures. Jessica's face had lost all color. What is that? What are you trying to pull, Arthur? Shepherd looked up, his expression now grave. Mrs. Wilson, This appears to be a more recent will than the one you provided to us. It's dated 8 weeks ago. Properly signed and witnessed. He turned to his colleague. Mark, take a look at this. The other attorney reviewed the documents, his frown deepening. The witness is Robert Hayes, Richard's business partner. The notary is legitimate. This will appears to be in order. Jessica lunged across the table, trying to grab the will from Mark's hands. This is absurd. Richard would never do this behind my back. Actually, I said, my voice steady. Despite the adrenaline coursing through me, he would, and he did, because he discovered what you were planning, Jessica. I nodded to Shepard. You'll find evidence in that file of Jessica's attempts to manipulate my father, including recordings of her pressuring him about his will while he was ill, emails between her and Trevor discussing how to sell off Dad's company assets after his death, and documentation of her contacting real estate developers about valuations before Dad had even passed away. Trevor's face had gone pale, and he slowly sank back into his chair. Cassandra looked genuinely shocked, her eyes darting between her mother and the attorneys. This is all fabricated, Jessica sputtered, but her voice lacked conviction. Arthur is clearly still upset about his father's death and is trying to interfere with Richard's wishes. Maxwell Shepard, however, was already deep into reading the new will, and his expression told me all I needed to know. He looked up at Jessica with thinly veiled disgust. Mrs. Wilson, this will appears entirely legitimate. It leaves majority ownership of Wilson Construction to Arthur, along with the family home and personal assets. You receive a settlement of $2 million, and your children each receive trust funds of $500,000 for education or business purposes. Jessica's face contorted with fury. That's impossible. Richard promised me everything. We had an agreement. Her outburst hung in the air, damning in its nakedness. I kept my voice level. Dad discovered your plans, Jessica. He found the emails, noticed the missing documents, and realized what you were doing. He created this will to protect what he spent his life building, and to ensure it went to someone who would honor his legacy rather than sell it off for quick profit. Jessica turned to Shepard desperately. This can't be legal. Richard was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. Arthur must have manipulated him. The will includes a letter from Richard's oncologist stating he was mentally competent on the date this was signed, Shepard replied, still reviewing the documents. And there's a video recording of the signing included on this thumb drive. He held up the drive Dad had left in the safe deposit box. Jessica's carefully constructed facade finally cracked completely. You ungrateful little bastard. She hissed at me. After everything I did for your father, everything I put up with, you think you can just waltz in here and take what's rightfully mine? What's rightfully yours? I repeated incredulously. You married my father, then systematically isolated him from me, and manipulated him while he was fighting cancer. You prevented me from saying goodbye to him on his deathbed. You excluded me from his funeral arrangements, and you planned to cut me out of his will entirely, taking the company my grandfather founded and that my father built just to sell it off for parts. I shook my head. Nothing about that is rightfully yours. Maxwell Shepard cleared his throat, professional training reasserting itself. Given this new information, we cannot proceed with the reading of the will you provided. Mrs. Wilson, this more recent will take precedence, and there are serious concerns about how the previous will was obtained. Jessica stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This isn't over, she said, gathering her purse. I'll contest this. I'll take it to court. You'll regret this, Arthur. As she stormed toward the door, Trevor following close behind, She paused and looked back at me. You're just like your father. Too stupid to see when you're being played. After they left, only Cassandra remained, looking shell-shocked and confused. Did you know? I asked her quietly. About what your mother was doing. She shook her head slowly. Not all of it. I knew Mom and Trevor had plans for the money. But I didn't know about the manipulation, the emails, any of that. She looked up at me, tears in her eyes. I liked Richard. He was always kind to me. I'm sorry, Arthur. I nodded, believing her. Cassandra had always seemed more of a bystander than an active participant in Jessica's schemes. Maxwell Shepherd, looking thoroughly professional again despite the dramatic scene, closed the folder containing Dad's real will. Mr. Wilson, we should proceed with the official reading and execution of your father's actual will. Would you like to reschedule or continue today? I thought about it for a moment, then took a seat at the table. Let's continue. It's what Dad would have wanted. As I expected, Jessica didn't go quietly. 2 days after the will reading, I received a thick envelope containing legal documents. She was contesting the will, claiming Dad had been unduly influenced by me during his illness, and that the safe deposit box evidence had been fabricated. I immediately hired Patricia Daniels, one of Chicago's top estate attorneys, to represent me. After reviewing all the evidence, she was confident we would prevail, but warned me the process could be lengthy and painful. Jessica has no real legal ground to stand on, Patricia explained during our first meeting. Your father's will is properly executed. He was certified competent by his doctor. And there's ample evidence of her attempts to manipulate him. But she can drag this out, make it expensive, and put you through emotional hell in the process. Her prediction proved accurate. Jessica demanded a private meeting with me before the first court date, claiming she wanted to work things out amicably. Against Patricia's advice, I agreed to meet her at a neutral location. A conference room at Patricia's law office. Jessica arrived alone, dressed impeccably, and with her grief-stricken widow persona firmly in place. Arthur, she began, her voice soft and reasonable. We both loved Richard. He wouldn't want us fighting like this. I remained silent, waiting for her to get to the point. I'm willing to be generous, she continued. Drop this charade with the second will, and I'll give you $5 million from the estate. Clean break, no court battles, no public airing of family disputes that would upset Richard's memory. I almost laughed. $5 million? When Dad's company alone is worth over $60 million? Not to mention the house and other assets? Jessica's facade slipped slightly. Be reasonable. Arthur, your father and I were married for 15 years. I took care of him through his illness. I deserve to be compensated for that. You were compensated, I replied evenly. The will leaves you $2 million. That's generous considering what you tried to do. Her eyes hardened. If you push this, I'll make sure everyone knows how you manipulated your dying father. I'll drag this through every court possible. By the time the lawyers are done, there won't be much left of that precious company anyway. Is that a threat, Jessica? It's a promise, she said, standing up. Think about it. $5 million, clean and simple, or years of ugly litigation that would break your father's heart. I stood as well. Dad already knew the truth about you. That's why he made the real will. I'll see you in court. As Jessica had threatened, she fought the will viciously. Her attorney filed motion after motion, demanded extensive discovery, and tried every technical argument possible to invalidate Dad's real will. But each attempt failed. The evidence Dad had gathered was simply too comprehensive, and his precautions too thorough. During this time, I also discovered that Trevor had been actively involved in Jessica's schemes. Evidence emerged during discovery that he had been meeting with potential buyers for Wilson construction properties even before Dad died. Cassandra, however, appeared to have been largely in the dark. When she realized the extent of her mother and brother's deception, she actually reached out to me, offering to testify about conversations she had overheard. I didn't understand what was happening at the time. She told me over coffee, looking genuinely remorseful. Mom always said your dad wanted to provide for us, that he considered us his family too. I never realized she was manipulating him, especially when he was so sick. She shook her head. It makes me sick, thinking about it now. Robert Hayes and other longtime business associates of Dad's rallied around me during this period. They shared stories of how Jessica had gradually isolated Dad from his friends and colleagues, always with plausible excuses about his health or scheduling conflicts. Your dad started confiding in me about 6 months before he died. Robert told me during a strategy meeting with my legal team. He said things weren't adding up with Jessica, but he was worried about confronting her directly because of his health. That's when he started gathering evidence and making plans for the real will. The court proceedings dragged on for nearly 10 months. Jessica's desperate tactics became increasingly transparent to everyone involved, including the judge. She claimed Dad had been heavily medicated when signing the real will, contradicted by his doctor's records, that I had somehow forged the documents, disproven by forensic analysis, and finally, that Dad had verbally promised her the entire estate, regardless of what any will said, dismissed for lack of evidence. Throughout this period, I took over temporary management of Wilson Construction, working closely with Dad's executive team to ensure the company continued to thrive. I threw myself into learning every aspect of the business, determined to preserve and build upon what Dad and grandfather had created. It gave me purpose during the dark days of legal battles and painful revelations. One particularly difficult discovery came when we found evidence that Jessica had been intercepting my calls and emails to Dad during his illness, deliberately keeping information from him about my attempts to visit or communicate. There were instances where I had called the house repeatedly during critical moments of Dad's treatment, only to be told by Jessica that he was resting and couldn't be disturbed. In reality, Dad had been asking for me, and Jessica had told him I was too busy to come. Learning this broke my heart all over again, but also strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about honoring Dad and the relationship we had, despite Jessica's best efforts to destroy it. Finally, after months of legal maneuvering, the court issued its ruling. The judge's decision was unequivocal. Dad's real will was valid and would be executed as written. Jessica's claims were dismissed, and she was actually ordered to pay a portion of my legal fees for what the judge called vexatious litigation without merit. It was over. I had won. But the victory felt hollow in many ways. It couldn't bring Dad back or give me the chance to say goodbye properly. It couldn't erase the years of manipulation that had damaged our relationship. But it was justice of a sort, and I knew Dad would be satisfied with the outcome. The day after the court's final ruling, I received an unexpected call from Jessica's attorney. Mrs. Wilson would like to make one final appeal, he said, sounding uncomfortable. Not a legal one, but a personal request. I was wary but agreed to hear him out. She's asking for a small increase in her settlement, from $2 million to $3 million, in exchange for returning some of your father's personal items she claims have sentimental value to her. I immediately understood what she was doing. She's holding my father's possessions hostage for more money? The attorney cleared his throat. She considers it a compromise. Tell Jessica she has 24 hours to return all of my father's personal effects to the house, or I'll file a criminal complaint for theft and conversion of estate assets. The $2 million settlement stands. It was the last direct communication I had with Jessica. The next day, several boxes were delivered to the family home, containing Dad's watches, cufflinks, photo albums, and other personal items. I noted with a mixture of sadness and resignation that several valuable pieces were missing, but I let it go. Some battles weren't worth fighting anymore. The legal victory over Jessica marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. But the healing process was just starting. I moved back into the family home in Chicago, the place where I had grown up with Mom and Dad. At first, it was painful, every room filled with memories and reminders of what I had lost. But gradually, it became therapeutic, a way to reconnect with my past and honor both my parents. Jessica made one last desperate attempt to overturn the court's decision, filing an appeal that her new attorney must have known was futile. It was dismissed within weeks, and she finally seemed to accept defeat. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she moved to Arizona shortly after, taking her settlement and starting over somewhere new. I had a difficult decision to make regarding Trevor and Cassandra. Despite their mother's actions, Dad had included them in his will with modest trust funds. Trevor had been actively complicit in Jessica's schemes. But Cassandra appeared to have been mostly an unwitting participant. After careful consideration, I decided to honor Dad's wishes, exactly as written. Both received their trust funds, with the stipulated conditions that the money be used for education or legitimate business ventures. Cassandra reached out to thank me, expressing genuine remorse for her passive role in what had happened. I should have questioned more, noticed more, she said. I'm truly sorry for what my mother did to your father and to you. Trevor, predictably, never acknowledged the trust fund or contacted me in any way. Taking over Wilson Construction was both a challenge and a blessing. The company Dad had built was solid, with an excellent reputation and a team of dedicated employees, many of whom had worked with him for decades. They welcomed me with open arms, sharing stories about Dad that helped me see new dimensions of the man he had been in his professional life. I discovered Dad had been mentoring several young project managers, investing in their growth, just as he had once invested in mine. He had established a scholarship fund for employees' children and made sure the company's health insurance covered treatments many other plans excluded. These were aspects of his life Jessica had kept from me, perhaps fearing they would strengthen our bond. With Robert Hayes's guidance, I learned the construction business from the ground up. I spent time on job sites, in planning meetings, and with the financial team, absorbing everything I could about the industry Dad had loved. Within a year, I felt confident enough to implement some new ideas of my own, expanding into green building technologies Dad had been researching before his illness. The company thrived under this blend of honoring tradition while embracing innovation. We completed the luxury residential development Dad had started in his final years, and I made sure each home included a subtle tribute to him, a small design element that had been his signature. Beyond the business, I worked on rebuilding connections with Dad's old friends and colleagues, people who had been gradually pushed away during Jessica's years of influence. Sunday barbecues at the house became a tradition again, something Dad had loved hosting before his second marriage. These gatherings helped fill the void his absence had left, creating a community of people who had truly known and loved him. The emotional healing was slower and more complex. I struggled with anger, not just toward Jessica, but also toward myself. Why hadn't I fought harder to maintain my relationship with Dad? Why hadn't I seen Jessica's manipulation more clearly and found a way to counter it? A grief counselor helped me work through these feelings, teaching me that while Jessica had been the manipulator, Dad had made his own choices too, and that forgiveness, eventually, would be necessary for my own peace. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing what happened, she explained, during one particularly difficult session. It means releasing the power it has over you. It took time, but I gradually found that balance, focusing less on the years lost and more on the foundation Dad had given me in my formative years, and on the final act of love and trust he had shown by ensuring his true legacy would be protected. On the first anniversary of Dad's death, I established the Richard Wilson Memorial Foundation, dedicated to supporting cancer research and providing resources for families of cancer patients. The foundation's first initiative was a program to help patients document their wishes and communicate effectively with their families during illness, something that might have made a difference in our situation. As I stand here today, 2 years after that dramatic will reading, I can say with certainty that Dad's legacy lives on. Not just in the business or the foundation, but in the values he instilled in me. Integrity, perseverance, the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And perhaps most importantly, the understanding that true family is defined not by legal documents or blood relationships, but by love, respect, and mutual support. I've learned that justice sometimes comes in unexpected ways, and that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to choose how we respond. Jessica thought she could erase me from Dad's life and legacy, but in the end, her actions only strengthened my connection to him and everything he stood for. For those of you facing similar family conflicts or betrayals, I hope my story offers some comfort and perspective. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And remember that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary, especially when you're also standing up for someone who can no longer speak for themselves. Have you ever had to confront a family betrayal or stand up for what's right against powerful opposition? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our experiences is the first step toward healing. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their family struggles. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money or property, but the truth and the courage to defend it.